It all started with a very simple idea. Tell the stories of how successful middle market CEOs made it to the corner office. I'm Brant Handley, founder and managing director of Resource Options International, or ROI. We're the USA's premier executive search firm focused exclusively on empowering middle market companies to attract, hire, and retain A players while transforming top executives' careers and lives. ROI's Into the Corner office is dedicated to discovering how middle market CEOs advance their career, and we're making these remarkable and sometimes quite unbelievable stories available to you for the very first time. Listen and learn about the challenges they've overcome, the interesting people they've met along the way, and the lessons learned that steered these executives' unique journey into a middle market corner office of their own. I know you enjoy these CEO stories as much as I've enjoyed recording them. So thank you for listening today. And if you like what you've heard, rate us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm looking forward to you joining me on the next great middle market CEO adventure into the corner office. My guest today is Mike Grossman, CEO of Inflection. Mike has 25 years of entrepreneurial and executive experience and is currently CEO of the country's fastest growing background screening provider. He has also been CEO of a diverse set of innovative VC-funded software companies, including LiveCapital, Tempo, SugarSync, and Zetta, all of which were ultimately acquired. Mike's experience in large companies includes leadership positions at Intuit and Johnson Johnson and board roles at Borders and Quicken. He started his career as a management consultant for McKinsey Company, both in San Francisco and Sydney, Australia. He holds an AB in economics and a JD from Harvard University, and he's passionate about his family, his cats, international travel, science fiction films, tennis, creative writing, and quiet irreverence. Mike Grossman, welcome into the corner office.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you here. And we were talking just a couple of minutes before we got started, just kind of about the impact on COVID and what's that happening, of course, to your company and the general business. And we're recording this about middle of March, actually about the 10th of March today. It's June. Gosh, what month am I in? I can't even remember anymore. 10th of June. We're about going into 4 months into this thing, although I don't think this podcast is probably going to be coming out until some months later. But, just kind of tell us how you're holding out. You shared with me a couple of things about how this is truly, it sounds like, positively impacted your business in so many ways. So give us a little bit of a snapshot of what this has meant in the last couple of months for you.
Oh, everything was completely fine till around March 10th.
Right.
And then precipitously, results started going down. And over the ensuing 3 weeks, they went down about 60%. And then they plateaued. Wow. And then they started coming back. And now we're all the way back to where we were on March 9th, basically.
Isn't that fabulous?
So
wow.
it's V-shaped, and I'm not sure that's what I would have expected, but it's been very good to see.
That's a blessing. And you were mentioning before that you've obviously still sheltering in place yourself, may so into the fall, and many of your staff are, and probably a lot are not coming back. Have you found that you've had a level of productivity here that's at or better than what you had previously with folks in offices?
Generally, the answer is yes. Now, it's worth mentioning that Inflection has, for many years, had a work from home type of culture to a meaningful extent.
Yeah.
We have 3 main offices, one in the Bay Area in California, one in Omaha, Nebraska, and a third in Kiev in Ukraine. And then we also have about a dozen people spread out around the planet in various locations. So a large percentage of the folks on the team have, for a while, worked from home at least 2 days a week.
Right.
But this is the first time we've done it with 100% of the people. And it's gone very well. I do think we've been more productive. With that said, you lose something, I think, by not being able to actually see people in person. We do the best we can to replace that with creative and unusual virtual events. But I think that is still somewhat of a challenge.
That's awesome. So you've seen at the same level or perhaps even better productivity than pre-COVID?
Generally speaking, yes.
That's fabulous.
Now, that's not to say that people aren't going a little bit stir crazy. I can speak for myself. I'm doing this interview in a room, and this room has become part of me in some sense. And,
an extension, right?
Yeah,
appendix.
exactly.
Well, Mike, we want to get to Inflection and hear all about what you're doing there, but we'd like to start, kind of a little bit about you and learn about your early years. Tell us about, where you grew up and what your early family life was like.
Well, I grew up on the East Coast, was born in Boston, mostly grew up in the suburbs of New York City.
Right.
My father was an IBMer for many years.
Oh, right. White Plains, huh?
Close to White Plains. And he was in the research division.
Okay.
And then spent 1 year that I think had a very big impact on me and the rest of the family out in California. My dad got a sabbatical at Stanford. And we came west for 1 year, and it was a revelation.
Yeah.
And we all basically decided that at some point we'd all like to get back to the West Coast, and which has in fact happened.
Right.
So I ended up going to college on the East Coast.
Right.
And when I embarked on my career, I initially worked for a set of big companies. I was a management consultant with McKinsey. I worked at Johnson & Johnson. I was the world's expert on babies' bottoms.
Right.
At least a business sense.
That's come in handy in your later years as you've had children yourself, I'm sure. So, Mike, again, about your early family life, tell me about brothers and sisters, and what did your mom and dad do?
I have one sister, and she's 4 years younger than I am.
Oh, okay.
And then parents, my father is a technologist. He spent 25 years with IBM, mostly in the research division and doing interesting things related to robotics and artificial intelligence and other interesting projects. And my mother was an art curator initially in the town that we lived in Westchester County, New York, and then subsequently at Stanford.
And did your younger sister, get as enamored with the West Coast as you did? And did she finally move out there as well? Or
she did,
she stay back east?
And she also is similarly enamored with entrepreneurship, but from a different vantage point. So
terrific.
She lives in LA and is a professor at USC.
Awesome.
In the Marshall School of Business. She runs the Greif Center, which is the Entrepreneurship Center at USC.
Great institution. What were some of the earliest memories you had from mom and dad? Maybe some of the things that inspired you or influenced you when you were young?
My earliest memory was living outside of the U.S.
Oh, cool.
My father at the time was a physicist and had an opportunity to spend 6 months out of every year living and working in Italy outside of Rome.
Wow, fantastic.
And so when I was 2, 3, 4 years old, a large percentage of the time I was living in a small town outside of Rome. And I think it ended up having a very big impact on me because the fact that my earliest memories are from outside of the U.S. Has meant that I've always thought about the global arena in anything I've done. And it ended up having a very big impact on my life because many years later, I decided to do something international, ended up going to Australia, and lo and behold, met my wife.
Oh, nice. And did you speak Italian as a kid? Did you pick up some of the things?
My grandmother claimed that I did. But I think the truth is I knew about 10 words, most importantly, how to say ice cream.
There you go.
But I don't think I knew very much.
And you went there for how many years as you were growing up?
It was over a couple of years.
Oh, that's great.
And each year, about half of the time was spent in Italy. And actually, my sister was born in Rome.
Oh, cool. Any other, influencers or people that inspired you, maybe a coach or a teacher in those early years?
Not so much in the early years. As an adult, and maybe we'll get to this. I was significantly inspired by a fellow named Bill Campbell.
Oh, sure. At Intuit, right?
Yeah. And I met him actually after I left Intuit.
Had you? Mm-hmm.
He ended up having the greatest impact on my career of anybody that I've ever met.
He's a legend.
And deservedly so.
That's awesome.
I was very fortunate. I spent the better part of a decade meeting with him on average about once a week. And pretty much everything that I do as a CEO, I learned from Bill.
That's great. Now, was he an investor or an advisor from some of your other startups?
Not an investor. Okay. He just took some CEOs under his wing. In some cases, they were extremely high profile, people like Steve Jobs and Eric Schmidt, but also a lot of less high profile entrepreneurs or people running entrepreneurial companies.
Yeah.
And he did it because he enjoyed it, and
he really liked giving back. Yeah,
and he wanted to be helpful. Absolutely.
Yeah.
There was no other agenda than that, and it was very impactful for me.
Awesome. Were you a good student in school, secondary, high school?
I was very nerdy.
You ran the computer club, right?
I was very driven, and I guess I still am. And,
right.
But yes, I was always academically inclined.
Were you involved in other activities? Did you pursue sports or music, theater, debate, anything like that?
Sports would be the big one.
Yeah.
Played a bunch of sports growing up. I ended up specializing to a greater extent in tennis as I got to my teenage years.
Right.
So I've got a passion for that, although I have to admit that I think I'm now about as good as I was when I was 11.
Well, you've kept it up, though. So that's
I really haven't, actually, which is part of the reason. But there are many excuses, not the least of which is I can't run very fast anymore. But
right.
But yeah, no, I was involved in student government to some extent, sports, and spent a lot of time with the family. We traveled a lot as a family, and that also was something that I decided to replicate with my wife's support and our own family.
Now, you mentioned both you and your sister, pursued entrepreneurial careers. Hers, of course, now generated more to academic. What about in the early years? Were you involved in entrepreneurial things? Did you have the ubiquitous paper route, or maybe other things that you were involved with that were making money for you while you were going to school in the early days?
No, I wasn't. But I will say that I was pretty young when it occurred to me that entrepreneurship might be the path that I'd want to take. I didn't know what the word was.
Right, sure.
But the activity, and it actually happened in 8th grade. There was a 1-week creative type of effort in my 8th grade where all the students were put into teams, and the idea was to create a business.
Oh, cool.
All of which culminated in a fair where people had fake money to spend.
Right.
And it was a kind of competition where you were trying to generate as much of this fake money as possible through the sale of your products.
Awesome.
Our team came up with a creative idea, which was to not sell a product, but a sort of a service, really an event, which was the idea that everyone would get to miss class and see a science show where there'd be various explosions. And long story short is that one of my teammates accidentally set the ceiling on fire.
Oh, my goodness.
And thankfully it was sort of fire resistant, but we ended up by far winning the event. And
that's great.
It was my first taste of business, of entrepreneurship, and had a sense that might be the right direction.
Awesome. And did you have, jobs that you worked through high school and going into college, or were you, pretty much focused on school during those days?
I was focused on school almost entirely, and my professional side started when I was in college. So every summer I was working.
Right. Awesome. So you went to Harvard, and obviously a great school, both undergrad as well as getting your JD. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. Did that kind of, was that the school you had your sights on? Did you apply to a lot of different schools? What was kind of your thinking behind it? I think it was probably a foregone conclusion with both your parents being academics, right? That you would go to college. That was probably never a question. But,
I actually had wanted to go to Stanford, if truth be known, ever since I lived at Stanford as a kid. And for 6 years, I think on my birthday, my secret wish when I blew out the candles was that I would get to go to Stanford someday. But my parents were very clever. And so when I was 16 and college was starting to loom, they decided to take a trip. And we lived in New York at the time.
I was going to say, where were you living there?
So and so we took a trip that went through Boston. And
nice.
And there was such a big family connection, actually, to Harvard that I kind of switched horses at that point. My parents literally met in the freshman union at Harvard.
Yeah.
And so I was born there, and so there was a sense of nostalgia that was really
not a hard place to fall in love with either. Such a beautiful campus.
It's beautiful, and of course Boston's a great place, and then I've always been a Boston Celtics fan. So,
That's awesome.
And it was the Larry Bird era. What could be better than that? So.
Yeah, and then you went straight on to get your JD right afterwards, from I can tell. And were you thinking about going into a law profession at that stage, or tell us a little bit about your thinking of
No, I actually took a
break.
I got a job as a business analyst, kind of a junior consultant at McKinsey in San Francisco.
Oh, got it. Okay.
And then decided to go back to graduate school. And initially, I was thinking that I would do a JD MBA.
Right.
I never intended to be a lawyer. I just thought that the JD would be interesting, and which it sometimes was.
Good business foundation.
And it would be useful from a business perspective.
Yeah.
What ended up happening is, after my first year of law school, I went to Australia, met my wife unexpectedly, and found myself in the world's longest long-distance relationship back at a time when there were no mobile phones and there was no email or text and the like.
A lot of letters.
That was pretty all-consuming. And I realized that doing a JD MBA at that point, which would take 4 years, was probably not the best course if I wanted to make the relationship work. So that's why I ended up just doing a JD, even though I intended to go into business at the end.
So then you went back to McKinsey, is that right? After you got your JD?
I did. It was a negotiated settlement with my wife. And she had grown up in Melbourne, Australia. She has an identical twin sister, and at the time she was a lawyer herself.
Okay.
I met her at a law firm in Australia.
Right.
And we were trying to figure out where to go. And what we ended up compromising on is that I would go to Australia, but she would move out of Melbourne. And so we went to Sydney consequently, and I had an opportunity to go back to McKinsey, and so I did.
Nice.
But I really wanted to get to Silicon Valley, and it was only a short time later.
Right.
We were in Sydney for about a year before we came back to the States.
Well, you worked for two great companies, J&J, and I know that. I worked at P&G, so we kind of always looked at those other great consumer products companies as the wannabes. We always got the headhunter calls, of course, to go there. And then Intuit, you were there fairly early on, right, in '93, and the company was maybe 10, 15 years old at the time. How long had Intuit been around when you joined them?
When I joined, it was a little bit less than 10 years. I had actually come close to joining a couple of years before then. But then this was after we moved to the States. My wife decided to make a career switch from law to fashion design.
Oh, cool.
And so we ended up deciding to stay on the East Coast. But yeah, even when I joined, it was still pretty early. They had just merged with a company called Chipsoft, which was the maker of TurboTax.
Right.
But that was new. And the whole company only had about 400, 500 people at the time.
Early days. Fantastic. And that was kind of the springboard then for you to go do startups. Tell us a little bit about the thinking behind that, Mike. You worked for two relatively big companies. J&J was certainly large. Intuit was growing. They were beyond the startup stage, right at that stage. But then, you went on to a series of very successful entrepreneurial things. To be another Hewitt and start something in my garage? Was it, I've learned what I need to learn now and I want to take more risk? What was kind of going on in your mind at the time when you left Intuit? And I think it was LiveCapital. Was that your first?
Yeah, LiveCapital was the first technology startup that I pursued.
Right.
I would say that I was affected by the way I was brought up. I grew up in a family where creativity was regarded as a very high priority.
Right.
My father is somebody who's always inventing things, and my mother was involved in the art world, and so. Even as I ended up going into business, I was always drawn to things that were innovative and, in the perfect case, doing something that is both innovative but also has a really big and positive impact on people.
Yeah.
So that's what drew me to it. I would say it was a creative impulse more than anything else. The other piece, though, is that big companies are fairly political places, and I don't like that stuff.
Yeah.
It's not fun. I'm much more interested in figuring out how to solve problems and have an impact. And so the bureaucratic elements or political elements, even in great companies, were things that didn't appeal to me, and so I much preferred to try to chart a different course.
Now, were you in management positions before, starting up LiveCapital and going down that road?
I was starting to get into management, but the largest group of people that I managed while I was at Intuit was 3 people.
Okay,
so not exactly a large group. And within a few years after that, I was running a company that had more than 100 people.
Right.
So it was a big adjustment. I had a very big learning curve.
What were some of the learnings from, the management of people in that last job there at Intuit, and, reflecting back on some of the things that maybe were foundational for you later on?
I think one thing is that when you're an individual contributor, that you're used to doing things all by yourself.
Right.
And then as you start getting into management, you're relying on other people and you're delegating. And you have to figure out, when do you get involved and when do you not get involved? And what represents the right level of management? Are you micromanaging? Well, that's not good. But on the other hand, you need to know details.
Right.
And so what's the right level of abstraction? And I think that's something that takes some time to learn. I think the other thing is that when you're just in a role where you're just doing work individually, your responsibility is more constrained, I would say. I mean,
Sure.
You're trying to do the best job you can for yourself and for the group, but it's more circumscribed.
Right.
But when you're managing people, certainly when you're managing a company, you have an enormous amount of responsibility to the folks on the team and by extension, their families. And so I think it's much more stressful. I think it's and I think it's a very significant responsibility that you need to. I know I think about every day.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned Bill Campbell, wonderful mentor. And again, I'm sure you consider yourself so blessed to have worked with him and been mentored by him. But, we've also usually have a few tormentors, right, in our past, people that perhaps didn't provide the best type of training or development. And not that you need to mention any names, but was there behavior, particularly since you mentioned kind of the bureaucratic part of a larger company, was there behavior that you saw that you said, wow, gosh, I never want to be that guy or that woman, and not kind of behave that type of way or manage people in a certain way? Do you recall any of those lessons along the way?
I would say yes. I mean, I will say that the companies that I worked for before I went down this crazy entrepreneurial path, Intuit, Johnson Johnson, are great companies, and I have many more good memories than bad memories, and I met a lot of great people. But I would say that there were a small handful of people that I worked with or worked for earlier in my career who were mostly focused on getting the approval of their management.
Right.
As opposed to trying to figure out what the right answer was.
Yeah, doing the right thing.
And so from my perspective, an inordinate amount of time was spent trying to figure out how to spin things or position things to make things sound often better than they were. And not enough time was spent trying to identify what are the things that actually needed to be improved or made better.
Yeah.
And I don't think that way. I think that the nature of business is that there are problems.
Right.
And that's life, really. But it's also certainly business. And I think the responsibility, the challenge in a way, is to try to figure out how to anticipate those problems or at least solve them when they appear, and not look away from them, not try to sweep them under the rug, not try to spin or position, but to actually grapple with them and address them directly.
Yeah.
And that's hard, but I think that that's what integrity demands.
Absolutely.
And if you really want to build something great, I think that's what's necessary. Because otherwise, you don't fix the things that need to be fixed.
Right. Now, you actually had a couple of entrepreneurial ventures and then went back to Intuit for about a year. Did they purchase one of your companies? Tell me about that transition.
No, what happened is that I spent 10 years in the company that I had co-founded, LiveCapital.
Yeah.
And when I came out of that company, the people that I had started LiveCapital with for various reasons weren't available really to do a new venture. So I was trying to figure out what to do. It was some of it was life stage. One of the key people that I co-founded the company with, he joined the Peace Corps, so he wasn't available anymore. And so what I ended up deciding to do instead was work with a person that I had met at Intuit, and he had ended up actually as the chairman of LiveCapital and had become a venture capitalist and joined one of the companies he had funded. And it led me down a very different path of being really a professional CEO in entrepreneurial companies as opposed to being an entrepreneur.
Right.
And now I forgot the question you asked.
Yeah. So getting back to Intuit, which was kind of an interesting career path.
I felt like I was getting pigeonholed as a guy who did turnarounds.
Okay.
So when I ended up in this professional CEO context, often the companies that I would get hired for were companies that really had a lot of challenges, and the job was to fix those challenges.
Right.
And all companies have challenges, but these were companies that had received a lot of venture funding, and the businesses had done okay, but not great. And there were a lot of things that needed to be fixed. And I felt like, in a way, my scope of opportunity was narrowing, and that the opportunities I was getting all looked a certain way. And I said, let me change things up a bit. Why don't I go back to the thing I vowed I would never do and go back to a big company?
Yeah.
And so I went back to Intuit, which at this point was way bigger than when I had left. A 500-person company had become a 5,000-person company.
They're huge.
The problem was, when I got back, I realized that I really didn't enjoy it at all.
Right.
And having run companies at that point for 15 years, it was very difficult for me at least, to go back into a environment that had many of the kind of bureaucratic and political elements amplified relative to what I had experienced before. And I very quickly ended up leaving and going back into a CEO role.
Yeah. And you did a couple more startups before coming to Inflection, right? You did SugarSync, I think, also, and Zetta. Were those kind of in the same area of operations that you'd had before, or same kind of software providing?
No, I started to diversify. So the first part of my career, most of it was spent in fintech.
Right.
But SugarSync was different than that. SugarSync was a competitor of Dropbox.
Okay.
And so it was a very different
cloud
area.
Cloud storage,
mostly business to consumer. Zetta was sort of tangentially related to SugarSync, and that it related to cloud storage as well, but it was in a business to business context, and the primary customer were IT professionals. So they were very different, and that's what I wanted. I wanted to mix things up and do different things.
And were those companies sold then to other companies, and then you moved on, or what were the paths of those two companies?
Both companies ended up getting acquired. Yeah. And that's generally where I found myself for the last decade, is companies that are venture funded and ultimately getting them to an exit. Yeah. Inflection's a bit different.
Tell us about that. Now, we're at that point in your career. Tell us what you do, kind of the scope of operations. I know you've got 2 or 3 different locations, including international, and give us your business overview.
Yeah, I consider myself very fortunate to have been recruited into Inflection. So the backstory is, it was founded by 2 brothers who were very young at the time. They were university student age,
when was that? How long has it been?
About 14 years ago.
Oh my gosh! Okay,
and they ended up with a concept in the people data area.
Okay.
Started this business that I would describe as a kind of business to consumer rudimentary background screening type of company.
Okay.
And it started growing very rapidly, and they dropped out of school and they went out to the Bay Area and raised venture funding, and the company started growing very explosively. And with that initial product. And then they started thinking about adjacencies, the other products they could build. And one of them was called archives.com, leveraging genealogical data. And they ended up selling that to ancestry.com.
Wow.
And around that same time, they saw an opportunity relating to employment-related background screening. And that came about based on the feedback that they were getting from some of their business-to-consumer customers.
Right.
Many of them were small business owners, and they said, could help them do background screening in an employment context. So what started out as a skunkworks project, somewhat by accident, became the main part of the company. And so all these years later, the company now is entirely B2B.
That's the focus.
And focused on background screening, mostly in an employment context, but also in some non-employment use cases. and it's doing really well. I think that this is a company that can be a billion-dollar company. So this is not one that I think we're likely to sell anytime soon.
Yeah,
we're going to see how far we can take it.
Awesome. You've been there about 2 years, and I think you said a couple hundred employees in three different general locations. Tell us a little bit about your
about 150 people, 3 main locations. We are, again, mostly focused on employment-related background screening. The key distinctions with other folks in the space is that we're focused on small businesses and middle market companies mostly.
Right.
The company's heritage in business to consumer meant that there was a lot of online marketing expertise.
Sure.
And so there's an online engine which really fuels the business. And then we're also a modern Silicon Valley technology company with proprietary capabilities that relate to how we process data. And we're exceptionally focused, and this goes back to my Intuit days, this philosophy, exceptionally focused on delighting customers.
Yeah, fantastic.
And we found ourselves in a market space that's large, has several reasonably big companies that have been around for a long time, that I think are less focused on that. I think the thought of the space is commoditized, and we don't.
Right. Well, I'm very excited about the company. As we spoke a week or two ago, we work in executive search, and of course, all of it's C-suite, and we're just in the process of wrapping up a CEO search. And I'll be clicking on the website soon, Mike, and using the products, because as you described the services and the costs versus the usual folks I'm looking, I mean, it's a significant savings. So I'll certainly be sharing that with my other recruiter friends. But where do you see? I mean, is it mostly that middle market business that are using you? Do you also get experience with Fortune 500 as well?
We increasingly are. So the business is called Good Hire. Inflection's the company name.
Got it.
But the employment background screening business or product is called Good Hire.
Right.
We started at the low end of the market. That's how the company got into the space. So it's micro businesses, small businesses, and have progressively moving up.
That's great.
And so increasingly now, we also have mid-market companies as customers and also enterprises.
Right.
And so we have pretty big ambitions. I mean, we want to be the number one player in the space domestically and globally.
That's awesome.
And that's not the sort of thing you can build overnight.
Right.
But it's something that I actually believe is achievable. I also say that one of the other points of distinction is with others in the space is that we think a lot about not just the employers we serve, but the job candidates themselves.
Yeah, sure.
And it's, talking about responsibility, I think it's very important to handle the job candidate experience in a very thoughtful way.
Yeah.
And
confidential as well as
confidential, but also around issues like fair chance hiring.
Right.
And there's legislation that certainly we're advocates of called Ban the Box that try to protect people who have been incarcerated to have a fair chance when they're looking for a job.
Yeah.
We have a set of capabilities called comments for context that allow a job candidate to talk about the ways in which, if they have a record, why, and provide some context for that. So we think of it as a two-sided discussion, and it's we try to approach it from a socially responsible, inclusive perspective.
Love that philosophy. Great approach. Mike, reflect a little bit on your leadership style. How would you say it's evolved from, those early days at McKinsey and obviously J&J and Intuit to, your most recent startups and clearly how you kind of operate today at Inflection?
I think when I was younger, I was more directive and more involved in doing things at a granular level. And over time, I have stepped back from that and rely more, I would say, on the people on the team. The key is if you have the right people, you sort of help them and get out of the way to a great extent. Having said that, one of the words of wisdom the many words of wisdom from Bill Campbell was, you have to know the details.
Yeah.
And so I find that I ask a lot of questions. I think I to some extent, have always asked a lot of questions, but I especially do now. And I spend a lot of time now just trying to figure out where is it that we have gaps. And those gaps could be organizational gaps, they could be process gaps. I spend a lot of time thinking about what is it that builds sustainable, scalable success, and what does that imply in terms of how the company is run. Other factors, I think, have been pretty consistent from the early days. I've always believed in being very specific about what the objectives were and what the success metrics are, and measuring the heck out of all that.
Yeah. Awesome. You came to a company that was 14, 15 years old. I don't know if the brothers were still running it, but you've been CEO there for a couple of years. And company culture is a very important part of what people look at and look for, both from a recruiting standpoint as well as the job seekers. What's kind of unusual or unique about Inflection from a cultural standpoint?
I mean, we're a very values-based company, and so we have a specific set of values that we adhere to, and integrity is one of them. Transparency is another one. There's a set of 7 of them, and they're not just words on a page. I mean, I take them very seriously. We have a process that I've been using now for 20 years where we measure how well people in the company feel we're exemplifying those values. And we publish those results. We share them with the entire company.
Awesome.
And we show that in terms of the whole company. We show it in terms of geography. We show it in terms of individual departments, to try to identify where we can do better, and take action. So part of the answer is, I think that every company has a culture. I'm of the view that it's better to explicitly manage that culture as opposed to let it just happen implicitly. So actually define it, talk about it, measure it, and so on. I will say that Inflection is a special group of people. I joined the company partly because of that, and I think it's still true today. But I inherited a lot of that from the founders and what existed before I joined the team. And when I say that, I mean it's a company that really it's a group of people that try to do things the right way. And what I mean by that is high integrity, treat each other well. The golden rule is one of our values, and also treat customers in the right way, and then try to be excellent, try to be analytically rigorous, try to move fast while being analytically rigorous, try to communicate in a very open and effective way, and so on. I think ultimately the question is, how do you build a great company, a world-class company? And it's really, really hard to do. It's so dynamic and everything is always in flux. So it's a project that never ends. But I think that unless you set the bar that high, you can never come anywhere close to it.
Right. Well, bringing good people in, of course, is an important part of that. What do you look for, Mike, specifically when you're making bets on the people you invest in and hire?
I mean, I come back to the values that I mentioned. So actually, that's part of the hiring process as well. But sort of abstracting away from that a little bit, I look for people who are nice people that I enjoy working with and will get along with other folks on the team, who care about not just themselves, but the group, and trying to systemically and continuously improve. And people who are, they work hard and they're thoughtful, they try to learn, and not defensive. They're very collaborative. Those are the types of people that I look for.
Yeah. And do you have specific questions that you ask for that? Is that things that you kind of look for in the resume? How do you kind of get at that in an interview environment?
I mean, I try to understand who the people are when we interview. It's certainly my role in the interview process a lot of times is just trying to understand what motivates somebody.
Right.
And I like to understand, what do they think is their greatest accomplishment, but also what are the greatest failures? Because we all have had them.
That's right.
And are they self-aware enough and confident enough to actually talk about all that? I think that's an important issue. Because when you work with folks, you want people who are comfortable saying, something, I didn't do this right.
Right.
And we can do this better. As opposed to trying to avoid that.
Humility is definitely a very good characteristic to have, bringing someone in an organization.
I think humility is a really important characteristic, but it's sort of it's humility combined with confidence. It's the blend of those two, I think.
Absolutely. Well, Mike, you've been very generous with your time. We do have just a couple of last questions. And, of course, in these COVIDian times we're going through, whether or not we're post them or not, I think you've, said earlier in the podcast or before we spoke that it's probably going to be the fall before maybe things return to normal. What do you think the world's going to look like? What changes do you see ahead, on your own company's horizon and perhaps broadly within the, the industry in which you're working?
I think that we're seeing some of those trends now. I think we're going to see more people working remotely.
Right.
And companies, the trend towards having virtual companies with people in lots of different locations, I think is going to only accelerate. So I think that's something companies that are using products like Zoom or Google Meets, I think that'll be a critical part of the business environment going forward. I mean, initially, as people start going back into offices, it's complicated because you have to temperature check and you have to reconfigure cubes and you have to ensure that people are safe. What's interesting to me, though, is a lot of the people who didn't work from home before within our company, as many did, many of them are saying that they prefer it.
They're embracing it.
So
no big surprise.
I think that's going to be happening to a much greater extent. And I don't think that the toothpaste is going to be put back in the tube with respect to that issue.
I agree with you. Mike, one last question. We ask all this of our CEO guests. What, career and life advice would you give someone who maybe has their eyes on their own corner office or like you, sees themselves as an entrepreneur and, wants to start and run a company someday?
I think that it's important to not think of life as being linear. And that it's better to be open to pivoting and shifting and adjusting because you don't know what opportunities are going to arise.
Sure.
You want to try to stay in touch with what makes you passionate, what makes you happy, and not get overly programmed. That you have to do this and this and this in a certain sequence. Because it's not really the way, at least in my experience, that life works. Opportunities knock on the door when you're not expecting them, and you have to be ready, often in an instant, to open the door, and embrace it. I think that's important in entrepreneurship. It's important in business more broadly, and I think it's important in life.
And we may be seeing one of the biggest changes and opportunities in our culture globally today. I was speaking with a CEO guest not too long ago, and he said, Brant, probably 3 to 5 years from now, there will be companies that will be household names that we don't even know about yet, or maybe haven't even been founded, because they're going to be the folks who have really led the way in how we really work in the new normal of what's to come. So interesting times there.
I mean, change is the one eternal constant.
Absolutely. Well, Mike Grossman, CEO of Inflection, thank you so much for sharing your journey into the corner office.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to Into the Corner Office with Brant Hanley. We hope you enjoyed hearing our guest CEO story as much as we did. If you want to hear more CEOs reveal their journey into the corner office, please subscribe via iTunes and tell your friends and colleagues. For more information about Brant, Resource Options International, and the mighty middle market, visit www.goforroi.com. We look forward to having you join us for our next episode.